This is the first part of the second lecture. So, what are automatic thoughts? These are thoughts that are characterized by being unconscious, unintentional, involuntary, and effortless. Another way you could think about it is spontaneous without any need of effort on your part. Now, not all forms of automatic thought will satisfy each of these categories. They will oftentimes do so to varying degrees, and they will, like I mentioned, not always satisfy every single one of these. Now, that is okay. Almost nothing fits perfectly always into every single category. What really matters in this is that so long as a thought fits with most of these, we would count it as an automatic thought. Next, we'll move on to discussing schemas, which are defined as mental structures that people use to organize their knowledge about the social world around themes or subjects that influence the information people notice, think about, and remember. Now, because this is a social psychological class, or a social psychology class, I guess, this is specifically about the social world. But technically, you can have schemas about almost any kind of knowledge that you have accrued over your life. So they are more general than specific to the social world. Schemas are also probably one of the most common types of automatic thinking. Now, these are useful ways of organizing our knowledge. So what that means is they allow us to categorize and sort things in a convenient way. For example, you probably have an idea of what fruit is like. And when I talk about what is the most common fruit, chances are many of you are going to think about apple if you were raised here. Depending on the country you're raised, chances are the most prototypical fruit that pops into your mind might be different. For example, in Pakistan, for me, that would probably be mangoes, just because our mangoes are amazing. Now, is that all fruit? No. There are lots of different kinds of fruit, and lots of fruit look different than common conventions of, say, an apple. For example, a banana or a kiwi or even a pluot. I mean, a tomato is technically also a fruit, but we rarely think of them as fruit. Now, what defines the way we structured that is our schemas. We have representations of what certain categories and things are meant to be like. Now, it need not only be about an actual practical thing. Many of you have schemas centered around how to act in a classroom. Many of you come in and you sit down at desks and you all face the instructor. You are following an internal schema of what is appropriate to do when you're in a classroom. A very similar one that's actually very difficult to violate is chances are most of you have never walked into an elevator and then just stayed facing the wall until you got to the floor you wanted to get off on. The reason that's so weird is because it violates the schema we have of what is the appropriate behavior to have when inside an elevator, which is to stand facing the door and all awkwardly shuffling around and being silent when other people get into the elevator. Now, while schemas can lead us to erroneous conclusions, right? This you could think about as one of the most common being our prejudicial attitudes. These are also technically speaking schemas. We have ideas about an entire class or group of people, right? It can lead to very wrong conclusions about them. Ultimately, it overrides a lot of individual concerns about those people and those groups. But on the whole, they're very useful. They allow us to operate in the world, which is basically filled with incomplete information, and if you were always waiting for having all of the information present, you would never be able to do anything. And on the other side of that, if you had to always analyze every single thing you came across, well, it would take you forever to do anything and you would not get most of the things done. To go back to the fruit example, imagine if you had to sit down and spend a few minutes carefully scrutinizing the color, the shape, the firmness, and just the various spots and blemishes along with olfactory signals, smell of that fruit each time before you could decide, aha, this one is the apple and I will now choose to eat an apple. It would take forever and you would spend your whole day doing stuff like this, and it would take you until the evening probably just to get out the door, and well, you probably couldn't keep up a job and so on and so on. Okay, it also allows us to generalize things very quickly, right? It allows us to move through the world and easily categorize the things we see and come across. And while oftentimes categorization can be thought of as a negative quality because of how we apply it to other human beings, Ultimately, without categories, we would have an incredibly difficult time operating through the world. Just very quickly, imagine that if you did not have a category for traffic lights and for Christmas lights, to you, red and green light combinations would just always have to take time to deal with. And can you imagine if you were driving down a road in which you came fast up to a traffic light, and instead of stopping, you were just like, ooh, what pretty Christmas lights, and just it would go pretty bad. Right? So having categories is ultimately fundamental to the way we live our lives. It's just sometimes it can be problematic also. Moving on to an empirical demonstration of how schemas can affect us. So Harold Kelly in 1950 did a study titled The Warm and Cold Variable in First Impressions of Persons. It is referenced in your text, and I will try and put this up on iLearn, assuming I remember. So a little voice shout out to all of you. If when you are coming across this lecture and I have not posted on iLearn, if someone could send me an email, that would be great. Please do remember the bystander effect talk we had, and that goes out to, God, what, the 140 of you who are in social psychology. So don't assume that someone else will do it, right? If I get a few too many, that's totally fine. Okay. So the way this experiment went was it was conducted in a classroom, and the students were told that a substitute teacher would come and would give a 20-minute lecture. Now, before the substitute teacher shows up, the students who were randomly assigned to receive one of two manipulations. This just means that half the students received one of them and the other half received the other, and what determined the half and half was random. So they didn't just draw a line down the middle of the classroom. They probably used some kind of number generator and the student ID numbers or something for that effect. You can read the paper if you want the specifics of how they sorted the students. Now, one half of the students received the following statement about this professor: that people who know him consider him to be a very warm, industrious, critical, practical, and determined person. The other half of students received a very similar statement, except this time it said that people who knew him consider him to be a rather cold person, industrious, critical, practical, and determined. Now, for the most part, these two statements are identical, but we do have a very strong impression of what a warm person is like and what a cold person is like. In fact, you're probably already thinking of what that means, and you're probably not thinking that a warm person has a slight fever and a cold person is hanging out somewhere in the frigid Antarctic where their toes are actually freezing cold. The most common thing you're probably thinking of right now is personality dispositions based on warm and cold, and that's just yet another representation of the schemas that you carry. And that is precisely why they use this. So the substitute teacher comes in and gives their 20-minute talk, and then they leave, and the experimenter gives the students all a set of quality or trait ratings. And some examples of these would be choose between popular and unpopular, good-natured, irritable, humorous, humorless, humane, or ruthless, and you select on a grade between any of these. They were, I think, a total of 15 different traits that were rated on. Now, the type of manipulation they got made a big difference on how they rated this person. So, for example, the warm person was rated as being much more humorous than the cold person, much more good-natured than irritable, and much more popular than unpopular, whereas the cold person was rated as being much more ruthless than humane. Now, please remember, it's the same person giving a talk to the whole class. They're not receiving two different talks. This is all about what schema was activated and then them using that schema to interpret a fundamentally ambiguous situation. Because in a 20-minute lecture about whatever the topic happened to be, you don't really know anything about whether that person is popular or unpopular. Sure, you could make some notion of good-natured versus irritable, but even that would be somewhat of a stretch. Maybe they crack a couple jokes, okay, that one get. And humane and ruthless are pretty deep traits that are pervasive, but you would really need to know someone in order to really make those conclusions. After all, it's unlikely that there was a dog that got hit by a car in the classroom to which this person rushed to go help or put out of its misery. Excuse me for the morbid example, but I'm trying to use that to illustrate the fact that many of these trait qualities have not much bearing on that 20-minute lecture, or vice versa. And so people use their schemas to fill in this unknown information. right? It's incomplete information, and thus one used schemas in order to complete this task. Now, on that note, if a trait was very, very obvious, the schema manipulation had no effect. So one of the substitute teachers who came in, as there were multiple, was actually just unbelievably self-confident and actually a little bit arrogant. And when they were making ratings centered around arrogance or self-centeredness and confidence, the entire class rated this professor in the same way. And the activation of schemas had no effect on those ratings. So when some quality in the world is utterly obvious or directly in our face, there's no need for us to rely on schemas because we have access to the information directly in front of us. Whenever that's not the case, though, we will oftentimes default to our schemas. Just an extra piece of information, I made the comment earlier about how this is also related to prejudice. This is also why contact manipulations happen to be one of the best ways to reduce prejudice. By interacting with many different people across many different groups, we tend to no longer use at least the same original schemas we had because we have much more information about these groups now. This is one of the reasons why you find the most bigoted people are people who've actually not gone anywhere. They're people who have ideas about an entire different class of people without having ever really met them or interacted with them. You see, in that case, there is no information about the group to whom you are prejudiced towards, and hence one relies on schemas. And those schemas oftentimes come from our society and the world around us. We'll talk about that in a couple sections of this when we talk about culture. But it is important to know, right? When we have access to information directly, there's not really much need to rely on schemas. But in most cases in the world, there is not some obvious billboard that gives us all of the information we need, and hence we will default to schemas, for good or for bad. So there are three primary factors that determine which schemas come to mind. The first is accessibility. So accessibility refers to the extent to which schemas and concepts are at the forefront of people's minds and are therefore likely to be used when making judgments about the social world. Now, you can just think in personal life, we do tend to think of things we know or are familiar with far before we think of things we don't really know or are unfamiliar with. A good example of this would be, what is a normal breakfast? Many of you can probably imagine what a normal breakfast is, even if you're not regularly eating breakfast these days. And here in the United States, chances are that image of a normal breakfast is something sweet and sugary and maybe even large. Now, across the world, there are actually not that many places that eat super sugary foods for breakfast. Many places just eat what they had for dinner last night or some other salty variant of something. What you grow up eating, what your family has eaten around you, what you have seen in popular media for your entire upbringing, these things will powerfully shape what things easily come to mind, because that's what you have experienced over and over and over again for decades now. And, well, a couple decades probably for many of you. Nonetheless, when you think about your normal breakfast, that is going to elicit what that normal breakfast looks like depending on where you go. Just like someone raised in a different culture will probably have a different idea of what a normal breakfast is. And this is one of the most powerful things that shapes what schemas come to mind. It's what we have done habitually for most of our lives. Those are the things that will always come to mind first. This is also one of the reasons it's so hard to break habits. Okay, the next thing is our current goals, and these can have an impact on the schemas that come to mind as well. So the example given in your textbook is that you have a student who is studying for a clinical psychology exam, and they see a person who looks homeless sitting on the street, and the question is, will they define them as an alcoholic or someone suffering from a mental illness? The chances are that after they've been studying for this clinical psych exam, they're more likely to rate this person as someone suffering from a mental illness than being an alcoholic. Another example, if you wanted, was weeds in a garden. And most people, if they're gardening, tend to think of weeds in their garden as being a bad thing. Now, let's say you had gone and you were practicing to take some permaculture exam. Permaculture is a philosophy around gardening and growing food that is a permanent installation. You grow multiple different things together, they form symbiotic relationships, and the goal is that you're not constantly tearing up your garden and putting in new things and tearing it up all over again and so on and so forth. And while you're doing this, you might be more inclined to leave the weeds because oftentimes weeds are a good indicator of the health of the soil. And if you're sufficiently fertilizing the soil with various compounds, then the weeds really won't take that much out of your garden, and you might no longer see those weeds as such a negative thing. Thus, this goal of practicing for this permaculture exam or learning about permaculture in general might change what schemas come to mind. This is true for most of the goals we have. Now, the third way in which schema use can be determined is through priming. And priming refers to the process by which recent experiences increase the accessibility of a schema, trait, or concept. Just quickly, there are two forms of priming. One is direct, which is you are more likely to do an action that you have just recently completed in the past. And indirect priming is where you have someone do something related to a certain type of concept, and thus they're more likely to use that concept in the future. And we will talk about a study about priming on the next slide. So this was done by Higgins, Rolls, and Jones in 1977, and the paper is called Category Accessibility and Impression Formation. Same shout type thing for putting this on iLearn. In this study, participants were given two ostensibly unrelated tasks. This just means that they were given two tasks that were technically one experiment, but they were told that they were parts of different experiments and not related to each other. The first was a perception task where they were required to identify various colors while also at the same time memorizing a list of words. This was followed by an impression formation task, which they were given a paragraph to read about a fictional character named David, I believe, and then they were asked to make their impressions, especially whether those were positive or negative impressions about this person. Now, the manipulation in this case consisted of different sets of words given to each of the participants. The primary two are the first two given underneath this point, where half of the participants were given the following words to remember: adventurous, self-confident, independent, and persistent, while the other half were given reckless, conceited, aloof, and stubborn. After this, having now identified the colors and memorized the words, they were given this second, again, supposedly unrelated task in which they read a paragraph about this fictional person named David, and then they tried to make their impressions. Well, they successfully made their impressions. And in this case, approximately 70% of people formed a positive impression about David when they had been given the first set of words, so adventurous, self-confident, independent, and persistent, while only 10% of people formed a positive impression when given the second set, which is a pretty wild difference between the two, seeing as how they read exactly the same paragraph. If you're interested in reading the paragraph, you can find it on page 58 of your textbook. Now, it could be, potentially at least, that this positive and negative impression formation was actually based just on the positivity and negativity of those two sets of words. In order to test for this and make sure that that was not actually the case, they also had participants, another set, where half of them received a set of positive words and another half received negative words that were not really related to this fictional character David. And they had them again form this impression task. And in this case, the positive and negative sets of words had no effect on those impressions. Now, I do highly recommend that you read the paragraph and look carefully at these words, because you will see how these words can be used to interpret David's behaviors. And thus, it shows that priming can affect what schemas are coming to mind, because these sets of words all build a certain type of character in our mind, and once that character is active in our minds, we will tend to judge David based on the ideas we have of a character who fits these personality traits, thus changing our impressions of this person. In this way, priming can dramatically impact what schemas come to mind, and because schemas can so powerfully affect our interpretations of the world, priming can actually be used to change how we form impressions of those around us. Let's move on now to self-fulfilling prophecies. And these are cases wherein people have an expectation about another person, and it influences how they act towards that person, which causes that other person now to behave consistently with the people's original expectations, making those expectations come true. Now, this happens in a lot of ways, and I'm going to now talk about an experiment that actually has some pretty unsettling and profound impacts. So this study was conducted by Rosenthal and Jacobson in 1968 and is called Pygmalion in the Classroom. Just a fun extra note, Pygmalion is actually an ancient Greek character who fell in love with one of his sculptures, and then the sculpture itself came to life. You'd have to go look at some Greek mythology if you would like to know more about that story. So this was conducted in a classroom with young children, and it was tested in multiple classrooms across grades 1 through 6. Now, teachers of these classrooms were told in private that some students were likely to show high intellectual aptitude, these were called bloomers, and others were not likely to show similar types of intellectual aptitudes. And it is important to note, and I cannot stress this enough, that these students were selected at complete random. And supposedly the teachers were told that this was based on some evaluation test that the authors had conducted on the students, and that's how they determined who would be in the high intellectual category and those in the lower intellectual category. And they gave them several tests throughout the whole year, and especially they gave them some IQ tests at the end of the year, which is what is reported in their paper. Now, I'm just going to remind you before I talk about the results, the only person who interacted with the students and knew the difference was the teacher themselves. The students were completely unaware of this, and the differences were bogus, right? No students actually had any type of real evaluation at the get-go. At the end of the year, they were all given an IQ test, and this 10, 20, and 30-point gains, just a quick note about this. So one, it applies to all of them, right? So anybody who received a 30-point gain also got 20 and 10, and anyone who got a 20-point gain also got a 10-point gain. Now, these classrooms aren't making these students magical. We tend to see this kind of increase in IQ intelligence at very young years because young children are oftentimes developing the faculties that get tested in an IQ test. Okay. Out of students that received a full 30-point IQ gain, 21% of those were those selected as the intellectually high aptitude category, while 5% of those who achieved this gain were in the lower aptitude quality or category. For a 20-point gain, it was 47% of bloomers to 19% not, and a 10% gain, you had 79% of them were the bloomers and 49% of them were not. Now, this is a pretty stark difference. This is showing that a bias that the teacher has is dramatically impacting the development of these children. And this is across the first 6 grade years that these young children are involved in. And think of how much of a difference that could make in the long run for many of these children. And again, let me remind you, this was only in the teacher's mind and arbitrarily selected, and yet it came true. This is one of the most terrifying powers of self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, in the real world, still sticking to faculty and teachers, you're not really going to have some psychologists who are going to come in and tell you that some kids are great and some kids are not, and that's just going to change their trajectory forever. In real life, all of us, because we're all human beings, have our own biases and prejudices, things around gender and race and social class, family lives, so on and so forth, which determine this. In fact, one of the largest predictors or explanations of why there is a difference in mathematical performance between men and women is actually nothing to do with brains or intelligence of men and women, and has a lot to do with the implicit bias that many teachers have. Now, before you jump and attack all of your professors, it is important to note that oftentimes most faculty have no idea that this is going on. These are implicit biases that they carry and are unaware of. In fact, when they're told the truth, many of them actually will, for lack of a better terminology, recoil in horror because it is not their intention at all. Many teachers are not doing it for glory and big paychecks. Most of them are doing this because they care, but they're still only human. And those biases will dramatically impact the outcomes of those children. And just to leave you something to think about, please take a couple minutes to consider. How many times have you told yourself you are not a math person? What do you think you're doing to yourself? Further, if you are a math person, you can replace math with pretty much any other skill set. Art, technology, gardening, cooking, laughing, being social. Heck, it could be all of them for some people. But in this newfound knowledge that you have about self-fulfilling prophecies and priming, just consider it for a little while. And just so that it's not a completely negative thing to end about thinking, after you've sort of thought about that, just think a little bit about whether self-fulfilling prophecies have to have negative outcomes. And if not, how could you use this knowledge to better yourself?